Hi, everybody. I'm Penina Taylor. Welcome to Walk Through the Psalms week 11. Today, we're going to be looking at Psalm 14. And this week, we're also going to be doing things just a little differently, which I will explain in just a moment. David composed two Psalms, Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, which not only address the same subject matter, but are almost identically worded, so much so that one might assume that there was an editor error or something and it was duplicated, except that there are definitely some differences which we're going to see. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at Psalm 14, which is where we're up to as we walk through the Psalms, but then we're going to do a side-by-side comparison between it and Psalm 53, okay? Now, it should be noted that according to some commentators, and we will, when we do the comparison, we're going to go with this theme, even though it might not be apparent at first. Some commentators say that these Psalms are actually prophecies foreseeing the destruction of the first and second temple, Psalm 14 being the first temple, and Psalm 53 being the second temple, and that the slight differences between the two owing to the slight differences in why the temples were ostensibly allowed to be destroyed. So, according to these commentators, Psalm 14 is a prophecy about the destruction of the first temple, and Psalm 53, I think I said this already, but is a prophecy about the destruction of the second temple. Now, as we go through Psalm 14 to begin with, you may not actually see it, but when we compare the two, you're going to see why they would say what they said. Okay, so we're going to take a look at Psalm 14, which is Mizmor Yud Daled. Okay, so let's take a look at Psalm 14, Mizmor Yud Daled. It says, "For the conductor of David, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They have dealt corruptly. They have committed abominable deeds. No one does good. The Lord in heaven looked down upon the sons of men to see whether there is a man of understanding who seeks the Lord. All have turned away. Together they have spoiled. No one does good, not even one. Did not all the workers of iniquity know, those who devoured my people, as they devour bread, they who do not call upon the Lord? There they will be in great fear, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You put to shame the counsel of the poor, for the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord returns the captivity of his people, Jacob shall rejoice. Israel shall be glad." Now, in this psalm, there is no difference in the numbering between the Jewish translations and the Christian translations. Just a note, okay? And we'll look at that in just a second. You'll see why. All right, so let's walk through this psalm. All right, verse 1 says, "For the conductor of David, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They have dealt corruptly. They have committed abominable deeds. No one does good." Now, you'll notice that even though the psalm has the standard introduction for the conductor, Lemenetzeach, which we've discussed before, is our cue that David intended that this psalm become a standard prayer for all time. It tells us that there is something in here that should be applicable to us even today. All right, and as I said in my introduction, many commentators believe this psalm to be a prophecy of the destruction of the first temple. While it doesn't specifically address that, and unlikely would do so outright because the temple had not yet been built, it does seem to be hearkening to a time when things will be desperately corrupt. Of course, this isn't a new theme for David, as he spent so much time running from those who wanted to destroy him. He often saw only the corruption of people and only experienced rare glimpses of true righteousness. Now, my theory is that the reason that there is not a separate verse for the introduction is because it just says Lemenetzeach, to the conductor, and a song of David. It doesn't say anything else. All right, it doesn't tell us about an instrument or when he was doing something or whatever. So that could be one explanation for why they're connected in this one when normally they're separated. Of course, not much has changed in 3,000 years, right? Even today, we ask ourselves, as we saw in the previous Psalms, where's God? Why is he hiding from us? So this verse starts the psalm by telling us that the fool has said in his heart that there is no God. The Hebrew word here for fool, naval, can also be translated as degraded, okay? And it literally means to wither, right? Like a leaf withers. Hirsch comments that a withered leaf has no life or potential for growth. And if you think about it, a withered leaf, what happens to it? It falls off the branch, right? It becomes completely disconnected from the source of life and gets blown around here and there by every wind that comes up. So too, says the commentary, who says there is no God? If God is the source of life and one has denied the source, he no longer draws nourishment from the source, nor receives life from it. He has no moral compass, nothing tethering him to reality. And so he gets blown here and there, riding the winds of whatever popular scheme blows by him today. Now, it's said that the fool is controlled by his heart, and the righteous controls his heart. In fact, one of the major lessons that we learn in Judaism is that all of our appetites can be, and really must be, controlled. The laws of kosher teach us that we can control the appetite of hunger, right? An observant Jew not only observes 7 fast days throughout the year, where he eats nothing for a day, but there are certain foods we're not permitted to eat at all, and other foods we don't ever eat together. Indeed, we even have a waiting period between eating milk and dairy products, right? So you can, and that's the message here, you can control what you put in your mouth. Now, you would think that that would be a really great word of encouragement for those of us who need to lose weight, right? But unfortunately, no. Why is it that I can control what I put in my mouth? I have no problem not eating pork, but when it comes to chocolate, what am I going to do, right? Okay. It is this ability to control our appetites, our desires, that distinctly separates us from the animal world. If an animal is hungry, he eats. The only time he doesn't eat is if there's no food. Now, I have a dog, and whenever I take her for a walk, she sniffs everything on the road along the walk. If she comes across anything that even remotely qualifies as edible, and I mean remotely, she'll wolf it down. But hunger is not the only appetite that Judaism teaches us to control. The laws of family purity teach us to control our sexual appetites. The laws of lashon hara, or negative speech, teach us to control our hunger for gossip. Of course, there are even more examples, but you get the idea. The person who is connected to the source draws strength from the source, exercises self-control, and stays grounded. But since the fool, the person who has said in his heart that there is no God, has become disconnected, he's controlled by his animal instincts, his appetites, and his desires. And according to the rest of verse 1, he commits abominable acts. Indeed, says David, he does not do good. We talked a couple of weeks ago about this idea of, but there are people who don't believe in God who still do good. And the question is it really good if they don't believe in God? But we're not going to talk about that right this minute. It's very important to mention here that this is the correct way to translate this verse, that it is the fool that has said in his heart that there is no God. The fool commits abominable acts. The fool, that is the one who has said there is no God, does not do good. If there is no God, then there's no moral standard, and there's no such thing as a truly good act. Like I said, we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago. Even if such a person were to do something that seems good because he does not believe in God, his motives are not pure, and therefore the deed probably is not truly good. Unfortunately, there are those who have used this verse to prove that no one in the world can truly do good. Now, This is very, very important for us to understand, okay? They say that this verse proves that no one in the world can truly do good. This is then used to build the argument that we're incapable of being righteous. We, being all mankind, are incapable of being righteous, even though that flies totally in the face of Scripture, and are all condemned to eternity in a burning hell. Burning in hell. This in turn is used to build the case that we need an intermediary to provide some form of salvation so that we can escape this punishment. But I'm telling you now, this is not the case. And there is even more evidence given in the rest of the psalm that that is a corruption of the text. This text is not saying that there is no one on earth who does good. Now, David is not telling us that there is no one on earth who is capable of good, who is righteous. Only that it is the fool, the one who has said in his heart that there is no God, who is incapable of doing good, who cannot be righteous. Okay? I hope that was clear. This is a very important distinction. All right, verses 2 through 4 says, "The Lord in heaven looked down upon the sons of men to see whether there is a man of understanding who seeks the Lord. All have turned away, together they have spoiled. No one does good, not even one. Did not all the workers of iniquity know, those who devoured my people as they devour bread, they who do not call upon the Lord?" Verse 2 says that the Lord in heaven looked down to see whether there is a man of understanding who seeks the Lord. The opposite of the fool, the one who said in his heart that there is no God, is the man of understanding. He not only acknowledges that there is a God, but he seeks to know him. You know, it's kind of interesting, I think, that in modern Hebrew, there is a specific word used as a general purpose word to describe all religious people. Oftentimes, it's also used to describe a specific sect of religious Jewish people, but it's the word dati, okay? A person who is religious is dati. Now, sometimes dati is meant to refer to somebody who's religious but not Haredi, but the word dati actually refers to people who are Haredi as well. It's all religious people are considered dati. So what does dati mean? It means someone who knows. Dat is knowledge, okay? It's a knowledge that comes from a deep place of understanding, okay? It's a realized and actualized knowledge. So from the Hebrew, we see that a person who knows God, who's religious, is someone who has knowledge. They know God. Okay, so now verse 3 can be a little confusing if it's taken out of context. It says, "All have turned away, together they have spoiled. No one does good, not even one." All right? This is going back to what I just said a minute or so ago about those who would take this passage and use it to try to prove that there's no one on earth who does good at all. No one. Taken by itself, this verse could be said to be saying that everyone has turned away from God and that there's not a single person on earth that does good. Again, not even one. But in the context of this psalm, it doesn't make any sense. In verse 1, David said that it is the fool who has said in his heart there is no God. He's the one that does not do good. Is it possible that now David is saying that there is no one who does good? Well, let's go on to verse 4 to help us understand. "Did not all the workers of iniquity know, those who devoured my people as they devour bread, they who do not call upon the Lord?" So here, David is distinguishing between two different groups of people, the workers of iniquity and God's people. So clearly, not everybody is a worker of iniquity. Not everybody is a fool, because there are also this group called God's people, who unfortunately, in the context of the psalm, are being devoured by the wicked as one devours bread, which means that in reference to those who do no good, he's still speaking of the fools, even though the wording of the poem, and I use that word specifically, the wording of the poem is a little confusing. Remember, the Psalms is poetry, which means that the words are not always exactly what they mean. You have to look at them in the context. Now, let's take a deeper look at that for a minute. How relevant is this to us today? There are those who would devour the Jewish people as one devours bread. Remember how we spoke about satisfying appetites? When one devours bread, he is satisfying an appetite. He's quenching a hunger. In a similar way, Israel's enemies seem to have a hunger to destroy the Jewish people. And what happens when you eat bread? Anybody who's ever gone off of all grains and carbohydrates totally understands this. When you eat bread, you're satisfied for a short while, but then when you become hungry again, you crave even more. Okay? The consumption of the carbohydrates creates an appetite for more carbohydrates. So it seems as though Israel's bloodthirsty enemies just can't get enough of killing Jews. It's an appetite, a hunger, and they've given in to their basest animal instincts. Now today in Israel, the day that I'm recording this, today there was a rock throwing attack on a highway not far from my house. Unfortunately, the Jewish driver of the car was killed. But what's the most surprising is immediately afterwards, Arabs in the city of Hebron, in English that's Hebron or Hebron, they were celebrating by handing out candy. Handing out candy, for God's sake. For them, this is a game. They devour us like they devour bread, nothing more. Killing a Jew is no bigger of a deal than sitting down and eating a meal. So what does David say in response to this? He says, there they will be in great fear, for God is with the generation of the righteous. Now, where it says there they will be, it's future tense. They are going to be. And remember, it said 2 verses before that, it said, don't they know? Don't they know? Do they not understand that there will come a time when they will know real fear? Because these are God's people that they're attacking, and God is with the generation of the righteous. As I often say, they're gonna get it. We just have to wait long enough. Now here, we have an interesting piece of information. You see how it says that God is with the generation of the righteous? So David's saying that there are righteous people, that there have to be, right? There have to be if he's saying that God is with them. So it does not make sense. If David is saying that God is with the generation of the righteous, it cannot be that he is saying earlier in the psalm that there is no one who does good whatsoever, that we're all wicked. It just doesn't make any sense. It cannot be that there is no one on earth that does good, but that God has righteous people. Okay, they, the workers of iniquity, says David, will be in great fear, those who do not call on the name of God. And David ends this psalm with these verses. He says, you put to shame the counsel of the poor, for the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion, when the Lord returns the captivity of his people Jacob shall rejoice, and Israel shall be glad. Now, the commentators mention that whenever you have the wording that Jacob and Israel, it's referring to both the normal person and the important people. Okay, so that's the distinction. I've also heard Jacob and Israel referring to men and women, but in the case of the commentary on this verse, it says that basically it's trying to be all inclusive. It's saying all of Israel is going to be glad. Okay, now the translation into English is a little confusing here, but in verse 6, David is saying that the wicked shame the poor, but God is a refuge for the poor, and eventually they, probably referring to Israel, God's people, will be vindicated. They will no longer be captives, and they will rejoice. But it is this phrase in the last verse, when the Lord returns the captivity of his people, that has led commentators to say that this is a prophecy of the destruction of the temple. In the case of the destruction of both the temples, there was an exile that followed. The first exile was into Babylon, and the second exile, called the Roman exile, spread us far and wide into the world. The first exile was a physical captivity, and the second was a mental captivity. Because it's in this exile, the second one, that we have truly forgotten who we are and where our home really is. We've allowed the world to tell us that we don't belong in Israel. And even most of us who believe we do seem almost apologetic about it. So now what I'm going to do is take a look at the two Psalms together and see what differences we find. Here's Psalm 53. For the conductor on the Makalat or Machalat, a maskil of David. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They have dealt corruptly. They have committed abominable deeds or injustice. No one does good. God looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see whether there is a man of understanding who seeks God. They are all dross. Together they have spoiled. No one does good, not even one. Did not the workers of iniquity know? Those who devoured my people partook of a feast. They did not call upon the Lord. There they were in great fear. There was never such fear, for God scattered the bones of those who camp around you. You have put them to shame, for God rejected them. Oh, that the salvations of Israel would come out of Zion when God returns the captivity of his people. Jacob will rejoice. Israel will be glad. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Well, like Psalm 14, Psalm 53 has 7 verses. However, unlike in Psalm 14, the Jewish translation separates the introduction from the first phrase, resulting in the numbering of the Psalm, Psalm 53, between the Jewish translation and the Christian translations to be off by 1 verse. All right, and you'll see how it fixes itself during the process of going through the verses. But the Jewish translation gives us 7 verses, but the Christian translation gives us 6 verses. Okay, so let's take a look at it. Okay, in Psalm 14, verse 1, it said, for the conductor of David, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They have dealt corruptly. They have committed abominable deeds. No one does good. Okay, and in Psalm 53, verses 1 and 2, it says, for the conductor on Machalat, a maskil of David, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They have dealt corruptly. They have committed abominable injustice or deeds. So no one does good. Now it's interesting. I think it's fascinating that even though the Hebrew words are almost identical, for whatever reason, the translators of this version of the Jewish scriptures, they don't always translate the same words the same way. So as you'll see, the Hebrew is actually a whole lot closer to each other than the English translations, which is kind of weird. All right, if you go through and you look at the Hebrew translations, they're very, very similar. The Hebrew is very, very similar. Okay, so of course, the first thing we notice is that the introduction between the two Psalms is a little different. Psalm 14 says, for the conductor of David. That's it. Whereas Psalm 53, we have for the conductor on Machalat, a maskil of David. So we see that there's a bit more information in the introduction of Psalm 53 than in 14, which may be why in 14 it's not separated from the first phrase or verse, and in 53 it is, because it has more information. In addition to the psalm being for the conductor, giving us a clue of David's intent, it also tells us that it's to be played on or accompanied by the machalat. According to Rashi, the machalat is a special kind of instrument. Its name is related to the word machala, obviously, which means a malady or an affliction. If it's true that this is a prophecy of the destruction of the Second Temple, then it makes sense that the theme would be related to this tragedy of tragedies. It's believed that the Machalat was tuned in a minor key and produced a dissonant sound that would underline the feelings of mourning and loss. The fact that it's not mentioned in Psalm 14 underscores the idea of Psalm 14 being related to the destruction of the first temple, and this one being related to the second temple, as the sense of mourning and loss was much greater with the destruction of the second temple. The first exile only lasted 70 years. And it was known at the time, although not in David's time, which is why it has to be considered a prophecy, but it was known at the time of the exile, the first exile, the Babylonian exile, that it was prophesied by Jeremiah as such, Yirmiyahu. Because Yirmiyahu's 70-year prophecy, the exiled Jewish nation had the hope of the promise of return. They knew that there was a limit to the amount of time that they were going to be gone, and the number was specific in Yirmiyahu's prophecy. Anybody who studied the prophets knew that it was going to be 70 years until they were released, and this comes kind of to the forefront in the book of Daniel chapter 9. Okay. Whereas there was no such prophecy accompanying the destruction of the second temple and the exile that it came with it. And that exile had more of a fatalistic feel. I mean, we're still in that exile today, so it makes sense. The Jews of the time had pretty much no hope of anything changing in the near future. And until the establishment of the state of Israel, things didn't change much in 2,000 years. There was no hope of anything changing in the near future and no promise of a specific end to the exile, save the prophecy speaking of a messianic era with the promise of a final redemption, but with absolutely no time frame whatsoever accompanying them. Think about it, where we're sitting right now. Things are heating up in the Middle East. Things are heating up actually all over the world. And it looks like things are getting pretty bad for Israel, right? So at this point, we can point to it and say that something is about to change. We really can say that we feel the footsteps of the Mashiach, the Messiah, in the Messianic era. Okay, but another way to look at the word machalat is the fact that it also is related to the word machil, which means forgiveness. Now, turning the first verse on its head just a little, let's look at the word maskil. Usually, this word is understood to be the term referring to a psalm, which is composed with special intellectual effort to serve as an instructive essay which would enlighten the reader to a deeper understanding of God's ways. However, if you'll bear with me in this, the words al machalat maskil leDavid, which is translated here as on the machalat, an instructive psalm of David, could actually be translated, if you stretch a little bit, as on the forgiveness of the wise man of David, or wise composition of David, or something like that. The implication being that although the wicked person denies the existence of God and cannot do good, the wise man seeks God and receives forgiveness. One other perspective on the terms machalat and maskil, given by Sforno and complemented by Rashi, renders this phrase as the malady of the intellectuals. Okay, machalat being a malady, sort of, and maskil being an intellectual. Okay, we talk about the Enlightenment that went on in the late 1800s in Germany, and what's the Hebrew word that's used for that? Haskalah, same root. Okay, intellectualism, enlightenment. It is Jewish tradition that in the time of the Second Temple, there was a lot of Torah learning, many scholars and people who studied the text. But unfortunately, they didn't let it sink in, right? They didn't transfer it from head knowledge to heart knowledge, because you can know a lot of things and it not affect you in any way, shape, or form. It's only once you believe it, which, believe it or not, we say believe, but it has nothing to do with the head. It has to do with the heart. Okay, until you believe it, it doesn't change anything. All right. During the Second Temple, there were a lot of scholars and people who were studying the texts, but unfortunately, they didn't let it sink in, and they treated each other disrespectfully. There's a phrase that says they missed heaven by 18 inches. It's approximately 18 inches from your brain to your heart. Okay? When the study of Torah becomes nothing more than an intellectual exercise, it is being abused and not being allowed to fulfill its purpose, which is specifically to change the hearts of man. Therefore, the destruction of the Second Temple was a much greater tragedy than just its loss. Verse 2 in Psalm 14 said, "The Lord in heaven looked down upon the sons of men to see whether there is a man of understanding who seeks the Lord." And verse 3 of Psalm 53, it says, "God looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see whether there is a man of understanding who seeks God." Now, if you look at the Hebrew, you will see only one difference between the two verses. The first one, Psalm 14:2, starts with the four-letter name of God, the Yud and the He and the Vav and the He. Traditionally, the four-letter name of God is related to this idea of generosity and creation and giving. Whereas the name Elohim, which is what we find in 53 verse 3, is related to the idea of restriction or judgment, din, harshness. So, in the first psalm, God looks down on the sons of men in a spirit of generosity and giving. But in 53, he's looking down in judgment. I referred to Daniel chapter 9 before, but a study of Daniel chapter 9 brings us to the conclusion that the destruction of the first temple was intended to be a wake-up call. It was a warning that we'd better get our collective acts together. Whereas, as noted above, even with the prophecy of Ezekiel, Yechezkel, which tells us that in the Messianic era, the temple is going to be rebuilt once again and things will be set straight, there seems to be a more permanent feel than with the destruction of the first temple. Now, there's a huge difference between 70 years and 2,000 years, and that could very well be part of it. But as though the nation as a whole knew instinctively that this exile would last a whole lot longer than 70 years and have much greater implications for the nation. So in Psalm 14, God looks down on the sons of men in generosity. And in Psalm 53, he's looking down on the sons of men in judgment. The rest of both of these verses is word for word exactly the same. Now, the word translated as understanding in both verses is the word maskil. Yes, the same word as in the first verse of Psalm 53, intellectual understanding. According to the commentators, it's saying that God is looking for someone who takes the time to reflect on him, which is followed by the phrase to seek out God. So if one understands who God is, if one intellectually understands, he's also going to seek God for the heart understanding. So here the word maskil is referring to using our intellect to understand God, and the next word, doresh, is referring to a desire, a need, a yearning to find God. Now, the interesting thing to note here is that the final word is Elohim, the strict judgment word for God. The intellectually wise person needs and desires to intimately know the judgment aspect of God. That almost seems counterintuitive, except that the person who truly understands God also knows that the judgment of God is completely fair and righteous, and that he can be truly trusted. Next verse, Psalm 14:3. All have turned away, together they have spoiled, no one does good, not even one. And Psalm 54 verse 4 says, they are all dross, together they have spoiled, no one does good, not even one. Now in these two verses, the first two words differ, and the rest of the verses exactly the same. So in Psalm 14, it says, Hakol sar. Hakol is they all have and then Sar has gone astray or left the path. They've all diverged from the way that they're supposed to be going. Now, according to the Midrash, at first these fools had merely gone astray, leaving some element of hope. There's always a chance that the man who veers off the path may eventually find his way back. He can always do tshuva. He can always repent. However, in Psalm 53:4, it says, kulo sag. They are all dross. In other words, filled with impurity. Now, say the commentators, the situation is hopeless. Hirsch explains that at this point, the sinners have degenerated to the point that any former spark of nobility and refinement have just disappeared. They are beyond return, just as base dross can never be converted into a refined metal. Psalm 14 verse 4 says, did not all the workers of iniquity know, those who devoured my people as they devour bread, they who do not call upon the Lord? And Psalm 53 verse 5 says, did not the workers of iniquity know, those who devoured my people partook of a feast, they did not call upon the Lord. So here we see a couple of differences. In Psalm 14:4, we have the words kol po'alai, all the workers. Whereas in Psalm 53:5, it simply says po'alai, the workers. At the time of the destruction of the first temple, even those who were sinners knew what was right. Everyone knew that what they were doing was wrong. Even if they chose to do wrong, they knew that they were doing wrong. And that if they turned out to be wrong, that there is no God, as it says in the next verse, they would be facing something very fearful indeed. In Psalm 53, the word all is omitted. At this point, so much has been lost that only some of the sinners may have actually understood that they face judgment for going off the path. And then in Psalm 14, we see again a reference to God as the four-letter name, but in Psalm 53 as Elohim, reinforcing the difference between God approaching mankind in generosity and forgiveness versus righteous judgment. Okay, now there is one other thing I want to point out. Like I said earlier, sometimes even the translation that I'm using, that I have copied here, which I got from Chabad.org, even though the Hebrew is the same except for those two things, except for the word all, right, which is omitted in 53 but is included in 14, and the difference of the name of Hashem. Other than that, the wording is exactly the same. But you may have noticed that the English translation in Psalm 14 says that those who devoured my people as they devour bread. And yet in Psalm 53, it says those who devoured my people partook of a feast. There is no difference in the Hebrew whatsoever. And the literal translation of that should be those who devoured my people as they devour bread. Okay? Ochlu lachem. Okay? All the workers of iniquity eat my people, consume my people as they consume bread. That's the correct translation of both, because it's the same word. So just to let you know that for some reason this particular translation does not always translate the English the same every time, but in this case it was the same. Okay, Psalm 14 verses 5 and 6 says, there they will be in great fear, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You put to shame the counsel of the poor, for the Lord is his refuge. And Psalm 53 verse 6 says, there they were in great fear, there was never such fear, for God scattered the bones of those who camp around you. You have put them to shame, for God rejected them. Here, the two Psalms have the greatest difference that we come across. If we continue going with the idea that the two Psalms were written with reference to the destruction of the two temples, again, the differences make sense. In Psalm 53, we feel a reference to the utter devastation that resulted from the destruction of the second temple. But also, the idea here is that the righteous judge is rendering a punishment for those in this psalm who were workers of iniquity, that if are more terrible than anything experienced by those in the previous psalm, okay? And then to finish it off, we look at the last verse of both psalms. Psalm 14:7 says, "Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord returns the captivity of his people, Jacob shall rejoice, Israel shall be glad." And Psalm 53 verse 7 says, "Oh, that the salvations of Israel would come out of Zion. When God returns the captivity of his people, Jacob will rejoice, Israel will be glad." And here we see the only two differences in the language of this verse. In the first psalm, it makes reference to the salvation of Israel coming out of Zion and God returning the captivity of his people. And in Psalm 53, it makes reference to the salvations, plural. At this point, after the destruction of the second temple, see, up until that point, right, at the destruction of the first temple, there was one exile, okay? There was only one captivity, there was only one destruction. But here, at this point, after the destruction of the second temple, the captivity that will be returned will not just be one, but two. That the vindication and redemption will be rectifying not just 70 years, but thousands of years of exile and damage to the Jewish people. And again, the other difference is the reference to the four-letter name of God in Psalm 14 and the use of the name Elohim again here in this last verse of Psalm 53. Not to beat a dead horse, but one last time we see that now we must trust not just the giving and generosity of God, but that in the end, he is the righteous judge, and every judgment is correct and fair and good. I think that most of us right now are praying verse 7 in some form, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion, in other words, come now, and that the Lord would finally return the captivity of his people, and that we will all rejoice and be glad, from the least of us to the greatest. May we all merit to see that day very soon. All right, so we're done for today. I'd like to thank you all for joining me this week. I'd also like to make a special request that you say an extra prayer for those of us living here in Israel, that God would keep us safe, that we would finally see the redemption of the world and true peace here on earth. I want to wish you all an amazingly wonderful week, and I want to remind you one more time that it's never too late for somebody to join, okay? They can always sign up and join us now. And for Hanukkah, I may be doing a special little promotion. We'll see that for a special price, they can sign up and they can have access to all of the videos that have come so far. So keep your eyes open for that. All right, have an amazing and safe week, everybody. And thank you for joining me. I look forward to walking through the Psalms with you next week.